Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crime Lines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. In April of 2010, an elderly woman living alone was murdered in her home. 4 months later, another elderly woman living alone was murdered in her home. In both cases, the women were stabbed and beaten before their houses were set on fire. New information released in 2021 by a cold case team may be the key to solving both cases, and today, Navigating Advocacy joins me to discuss. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. So hello to Whitney and Melissa, my guests for today from the Navigating Advocacy podcast.
Hello.
Hello.
So how are you guys doing this morning? Afternoon, whatever time we're recording.
Great. It's just normal summer day. Taking it easy.
Oh, the real feel here today is 110. So it's too hot. Like I'm ready to get out of this heat.
We had our first 100-degree day here in Kansas City the other day, and I was like, it's fine with me. I'm staying inside. I'm not going outside. So all of these numbers are pretty meaningless to me because I'm not leaving my house.
All that matters is what the AC is set to.
I know. We had to get a new HVAC system this year, which was very expensive, but I am very happy we did it because now my house it feels great. Feels great inside most of the time till a kid leaves the door open.
I hate those adulting purchases.
I know. So I wanted to have you on because as I was covering a different case on my podcast, I came across two cases that were in the news at the same time. And I thought, I wonder if any podcast has covered these cases, because a lot of times I'll cover the cases and I'll say, if you want to know more, here's a podcast that's covered it. When I went and searched these up, you're the only ones I found who've covered these cases. Do you find that's common with the cases you cover?
Every now and then it happens. Because we go state by state, I feel like that kind of narrows down our selection process. Whitney and I always say that picking the cases is the hardest aspect of this entire job. So it happens from time to time. This one, I went back after you approached us with this to look and see if there was any additional new information out there. And I saw that we were the only ones that covered it. I was like, seriously? And we covered it a couple years ago. So I was shocked that there's not more out about it because it's pretty crazy.
It's the hardest thing is to pick the cases. And even then, because we do unsolved, that narrows it down a little bit further. But then the longer we do this, the harder it is to pick, in my mind.
Right. I imagine that it's hard to find, especially when you're covering only unsolved cases, ones that have more than 10 minutes worth of information. And it's, the ones that only have 10 minutes worth of information, sometimes it's more important to get those out there because obviously nobody's talking about them. So they're falling away from people's ears and their eyes, and they're not thinking about those cases. But I mean, it's really hard. Crime Lines is kind of a longer show. So I have the problem that sometimes I'll find a case and there really is only 20, 25 minutes worth of information. So if I come up with that, I usually release those as bonus episodes. But I mean, it's tricky.
It is. And that's why we have so many episodes of ours that are shorter, because this deserves due diligence, or it deserves our due diligence of sharing this information. But this is the very little information that's available. And with them all being unsolved, us getting decent information from law enforcement or things like that is slim pickings because they're always active cases and they're not willing to give us much. Usually an incident report, if we're lucky, rarely any in-depth information.
One of the things with these cases that we're going to talk about is I know you're victim-centered. I always try to give back story about the victim so people see them not just as the worst thing that ever happened to them, but as a whole person. But because of the lack of coverage, the first case we're going to talk about is Dolores Alliotts. And I looked up her obituary and it basically was like name, date, parents' names, brothers. And that was it. No other information about her. So I was going through the newspaper archives to get the man on the street interviews with the neighbors to get any information about her at all. And she was a bit of a loner, much like the other person we're going to talk about too. So people really didn't know her very well.
Yeah. And I find that, especially if they don't have a close-knit family, less gets put out there about them, because that's essentially the only way that we can have access, especially before social media, to know who these people were before this tragic day. So yeah, same thing. I had such a hard time finding any information on either of these two victims.
I started this because I covered the Rob Cantor case, which we can get into. I like to follow a timeline, so we'll follow a timeline today. And the first one is, like I said, Dolores Alliotts, and she lived in Palisades Park, New Jersey. So she lived alone in her house, which I believe was her family home, because she lived there until her mother died. She had 2 brothers. One had already passed away by the point we're talking about, and the other one was a successful businessman, had nieces and nephews that she was connected with, but it seems like she wasn't very close to anybody. I was talking earlier about those man on the street interviews, and one of them was actually the mayor of Palisades Park, who grew up across the street from her. And he said he used to mow their lawn, and when it would be time to pay, Dolores would pay him and slip him an extra $1 or $2 and then be like, "Don't tell my mom." Just kind of cute when you think about this old lady living with her even older mom, slipping this teenager a couple extra bucks. And he ended up becoming the mayor of the town. So I thought that was kind of cute. His mom actually still lived in the neighborhood at the time this case happened. So did you guys want to tell us a little bit about what happened on April 28th, 2010?
It was around 2:38 in the morning. The police got a report of a house fire. They arrive on scene and they find Dolores is the only occupant of that residence, that she was deceased inside the house. Once they start investigating, they learn that she died of a combination of blunt force trauma to her head, as well as multiple stab wounds. A significant number of stab wounds. We're talking 55 stab wounds, which then gets us into this whole situation of this seems, personal or a vendetta, like anger about it. But who was close enough to Dolores to even have those feelings about her, which I always found that extremely unusual circumstances of her death.
For something that is as intimate as a stabbing, let alone 55 times, there's something behind it. It's not a random robbery. It's not a victim of opportunity in my mind. There has to be some sort of very personal motive behind something that brutal.
Yeah, I was surprised when I learned how many stab wounds there were when that information was, when I came across that in my research, because if she was stabbed a couple times and beaten, that could be, a robber she's fighting back and he grabs a knife. But 55 is a lot. That's a lot of physical effort. I think people need to take a minute and think about making a repetitive motion with your arm 55 times in a row. That takes a lot of effort. And so it does always come across as personal. But, like we said, Dolores, she was a 69-year-old woman who lived alone, had no children, had little by way of inheritance that someone would get. There's no motive to match that passion of a murder.
Very much overboard, because she's an older woman. I don't believe they needed to do all of that to just subdue her if it was a robbery or that type of thing.
So after she was killed, the person set the house on fire. And that is what alerted the neighbors who smelled smoke to look out the window and call 911. The case went cold. In 2013, her family offered a reward of $25,000, and that helped get the case back in the media, because in the 3 years, it had really faded. And so to get some more coverage, get some more anniversary coverage, they offered this reward, hoping someone would finally come forward. And the investigators and the prosecutor had some statements for the media on things that had not been reported on before. like they believe that the killer may have been someone she had an interaction with before this, who may have posed as like a landscaper or a real estate agent to get her guard down. And they also said they thought he may have tried that ruse on other women in the neighborhood and tried to get into their homes on false pretenses, which that feels like such a random thing. So I have to assume they have witness statements that lead them to believe this.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's very specific. A landscaper, perhaps. I do live in a neighborhood, so there are people that walk by offering lawn services. I mean, we get a card on our door at least once a week for that, and cleaning services and solar panels. So that doesn't seem out of the realm that perhaps a landscaper, sure. Most real estate agents aren't going door to door anymore. I don't think they even did that in 2010. That wasn't a safe business practice. As someone who has a real estate license, they don't encourage you to do that like they once did. So there has to be something more for them to automatically kind of close in on those two professions.
One of the things they also said is they believe he may have cut himself, but they didn't say that they found male DNA at the scene or they found his blood. So I'm not sure if they're saying he may have cut himself just because if you stab someone 55 times, it's such a graphic thing to think about, and I hate thinking about it. But if you've ever washed dishes and you have a wet knife in your hand, it's slippery. When you stab someone 55 times, that knife is getting wet and slippery, and people regularly cut themselves during stabbings. It's possible he did that. The fire, especially if it, was on her clothes or her body, may have destroyed if he did leave DNA behind.
Yeah, very true. And I know perpetrators set these fires to cover up evidence, but I'm like, I feel like that just brings so much more attention to it. I mean, at the same time, you are covering up evidence, but you are bringing attention to it right away versus if you just left.
Especially in these cases of these older women living alone. Honestly, if he had just walked out, how soon would they have found Dolores? When her mail piled up? When, nobody brought in the paper for a few days? I mean, I don't think her body would have been found so quickly if there was not a fire.
Agreed. Having the timeline is so significant, a very narrow timeline. And so the fact that a fire was set makes it like, oh, they know exactly when she was killed and can narrow down a lot of information based off of that.
It also wasn't a small fire. It was a large fire, like a 2-alarm fire that required the big truck that had to bring in the big water hose with the ladder from the top. A huge, huge fire. So there's got to be some sort of other evidence there. There has to be an accelerant somewhere. So he had to have brought that with him or spent time in the house to find an accelerant on site, in my mind. Or there's pre-planning here.
And something they have not released in this case or the next one we're going to talk about is if anything was taken from the homes. I couldn't find what they think the motive was in either of them, but if we're talking about it may have been someone who used a ruse to get into her house, robbery seems like a pretty likely motive in that regard. And so I think with this case, what they're hoping for is that someone who lives in the area back in April of 2010 remembers a young man in their life who had a cut on his hand, that he had some vague explanation for, who may have had clothes that smelled like smoke or clothes that he threw away, maybe shoes that you noticed a little blood smear on and he said he had a bloody nose, something like that. They want people to be thinking like that to then say, wait, my nephew came by or this guy I know was at this party and it seemed weird. And they're hoping those kinds of leads will get them some suspects. The next case happened not long after this one. So we're talking from April until August. Another woman who lived in the same county, Bergen County, but she lived in Teaneck. And my listeners know Teaneck because we just covered the Rob Cantor case. And this woman's name was Joan Davis. And I don't know if when you guys looked it up, if you had to make sure you didn't just get hits for the actress, because
Yes.
That's all I was getting. And so I had to get a little more specific in my searches. She also lived alone, and she was born in New Haven, Connecticut, which is, I wasn't born in New Haven, but I'm from New Haven County. So, I know the area really well. She grew up there. She had a sister who she had kind of this on and off relationship with. She didn't move to Teaneck until 1982. And at that point, none of her neighbors knew anything about her. They just knew she was this lady who lived alone. And occasionally she would make some vague things like she worked as a freelance writer or she had been in the Foreign Service, but she never gave specifics. Many years after her death, her nephew gave an interview to the Record, and that's where all of the information on her past comes from. She did work in the Foreign Service. She lived in Rio de Janeiro for about 2 years, and that's when she changed her last name. She was dating a guy there whose last name was Davies. And so she changed her last name to Davis. That's not her original last name. And nobody really knows why. They ended up breaking up at some point. She got sent back to the United States from Brazil. And then she waited on another assignment and it never came. And I think this is a clue of when possibly her mental health started getting a little rocky. Her family said she started showing some signs of paranoia. She believed the government was purposely discriminating against her. Some, lady in Connecticut, they were purposely keeping her from the Foreign Service. She would be very fearful and suspicious of new people. The neighbors in Teaneck said she didn't even like giving people her phone number. She never would have been on social media. She never would have been checking in on Facebook. Not a chance. She would talk about people following her, someone being out to get her, but it was very vague. She did keep meticulous notes about her everything. I mean, when she would meet with her sister, and I call it meeting because they were on and off again estranged. Occasionally, Mary would come visit her. They would have conversations of which she would take notes, then send the minutes of the meeting with her observations and conclusions from what they talked about to her sister. She was just different. She was different. Because of these notes, we do know that she saw therapists off and on for years. So it looks like she was trying to find a way to function in the world. And it was difficult for her.
Yeah, she seemed like a very meticulous, detail-oriented person. That's the vibe I got from reading some of the things about her.
You did not use the word gadfly in your episode.
I did not.
I absolutely used it because I was like, were these articles written in the 1930s? This is amazing. But yeah, that's pretty much how she was being portrayed in every article. Wouldn't you agree that she was just this critic of the government?
She was, and she would do her due diligence at making sure they were walking a fine line in her community. I don't know how broad she would get if it was, United States government as well. But I know definitely in her town, she was meticulous at checking everything that the local government did, down to a fine-tooth comb about the financials, that making sure a penny was accounted for.
She would go and look over the city council minutes. They have to post the agenda, sunshine laws. They have to post it within, 24 hours before the meeting. So she would show up at noon every Tuesday and go over it line by line so she knew what they were talking about, so she could go home, come up with her thoughts and opinions on it, look at any reports that were submitted, and then be ready to give her opinion at the city council meeting. Honestly, I don't know that Joan went much out of Teaneck because she made this a full-time job. I don't know how she would have had time to take on the national stage. She spent a lot of time and she cared a lot.
She was the type of woman that there's a time limit on how much you can talk at a city council meeting. Robert's rules of orders dictate because this type of person will go forever.
She is absolutely the reason they have that limit, and they had to enforce the limit on her. But she wasn't even just at the city council meeting. If the Public Works Department had a meeting that was open to the public, if the park board had a meeting that was open to the public, she went to all of them. She did not own a car. This is a part of the story that I was like, this is actually, it makes you think Teaneck, New Jersey is like a place you'd want to live. She did not have a car. So one of the council members who lived in her neighborhood would pick her up and bring her to the city council meetings, where she would get up and give her 5-minute speech on how he is dead wrong on everything he just said and how he's ruining the city. I mean, she was very polite, everyone said. She was direct, but never rude. But then they'd have to get in the car and he'd have to drive her home. But he did it every week. He drove her to every meeting she wanted to go to that he was going to. We say like she was like this, an annoyance, a critic of the government. But the New York Times actually did an article on after her death because of her public participation in the process. They did an article and another word was used that I think describes Joan much better, and that is harmless. She was harmless. She cared a lot about issues. She cared about racial justice. One of the things that got her really into the local government was when a police officer in Teaneck shot a Black teenager. That's what really got her started with going. She cared about the environment. She cared about how they treated employees. Like when they'd want to bring in contractors, she's like, this just feels like you're pushing out our employees. And then she didn't like spending, she was very anti-wasteful spending. So she would go and she'd talk about those things. She cared a lot.
Yeah, it just seems like she loved her community and she wanted it's like the best for it. And she was going to do the work to make sure everything was good for her community. And I love that, honestly. There's not enough people like that anymore.
The thing that really surprises me about her is she's someone who cares very much about people and had like zero relationships with people. When the Gulf War broke out in 91, she started going to anti-war protests where she met the people at those protests, the Quakers. They're always at those protests. And so she started attending their services. But the political activism does not go into their services. That's left at the door. That was hard for Joan. And so she'd go and she'd want to talk about all these political issues because she found like-minded people, but that church within their walls was not the place. So she ended up feeling on the outside and she stopped going. And I think that is something, I think she had a hard time fitting in.
It was definitely not the platform for her. She was looking for a group of people that were willing to discuss these issues and have more of a collaborative effort, but that particular place was not it.
So she was very private about her life other than her political views. Literally everybody in town knew her political views. It's so interesting to have this woman who was just such a loner. She didn't speak with her family. Her sister used to write to her, but Mary ended up with a neurological condition towards the end of her life, so she couldn't write letters anymore. So they just completely fell out of contact. She was not in contact with her nephews at the time of her death. So she really had nobody, but literally everybody in town knew who she was. When she died, it was in the New York Times. I mean, it's just such an interesting kind of dichotomy of a life. And I find her as a human being so fascinating. So fascinating. But of course, we wouldn't know anything about Joan Davis if something terrible didn't happen on August 17th of 2010. And I don't know if you guys want to go ahead and cover that a little bit.
Sure. On August 17th, 2010, at around 10:50 p.m., Joan lived on Alpine Drive and yet another house fire broke out. It was there that they found a body inside again, which is very much like Dolores. And unfortunately, they had to use dental records to confirm that it was Joan. She also had died from a combination of blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds. But something that's a little bit different is Joan was bound at her hands and feet before this fire was set, which Joan sounds like she would be a little bit more vocal if someone was attacking her than Dolores. So perhaps that was precautionary measures for her perpetrator because she's going to run out and make some noise.
That was 100% my thought, is that just in what I know of their personalities, like someone could come into Dolores's house and she might not fight back, but I can't imagine Joan didn't have a frying pan in her hand as soon as she saw someone in her house. Like, I just see Joan not even thinking twice about fighting back.
Yeah, and in this case, I don't necessarily believe a person could pretend to be a landscaping company or a realtor to get access to her house because she was so private.
Exactly.
So she might have had to actually break into Joan's house.
I also feel like Joan would know every licensed landscaper and real estate agent because she has gone through the city records and would know every person. So if someone that she hadn't recognized before, she would not have been opening that door.
And it's interesting because she had a sign on her door. This is how I found out about the Quaker Association that she had, is because the sign said Friends for Peace. So I screenshotted the sign and I did a reverse Google image search to figure out where it came from. And it's on the Quakers website. And that sent me down the rabbit hole of how I found out she went to the Quaker church for a little bit. Anyway, a little glimpse into my ridiculous research process. But she has a sign that says Friends for Peace. So I think anyone breaking in would not expect to find Joan Davis. She cared a lot about peace, but I think she would have protected herself.
I agree.
Agreed. And I was going to ask you about the Quaker aspect of it because I didn't find that. I knew she had that sign on there, but I didn't find the Quaker aspect. And I actually had to ask Whitney what a Quaker was earlier. What was this? But yeah, so that's definitely an interesting aspect of the case that I didn't even find.
I think it just gave me another glimpse into who she was. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything. I do not think the Quakers killed her, but just that connection. But also she found like-minded people, but she still didn't feel like she fit in because she's just a different kind of person. Like I said, she fascinates me.
I do think it's interesting how quickly rumors grew around Joan, though, because she was so good at digging in deep and finding all of the nooks and crannies of where did this penny go and where did that penny go, or asking those difficult questions that the rumors saying that she uncovered something sinister and some conspiracy theories, for that to immediately come forward after her death. I found that interesting.
Yeah, that was the main rumor. And you can see why. I mean, it was she made a career out of it, out of keeping an eye on the government, but she never made it on the inside. She had run for the council a couple of times in the 90s, never got elected, which is actually the only reason people knew anything about her education was because you kind of disclose that sort of thing when you're campaigning. But she had done that, but she had never been in a position where she would have seen something. Every single thing she had access to was a public record. Every single thing in there anyone else could have found. I think people were grasping at straws to try to understand it, but also feel safe in their neighborhood. Because if Joan, living in a nice house in a nice neighborhood, wasn't safe, then who was?
Exactly. It's definitely scary.
This case also went cold, just like Dolores's case. And in the news, I'm sure you saw in the newspaper archives, the attempts to link these two cases was pretty big. And the police, I'm like, get some consistency in messaging. They would go back and forth. In some articles, they're like, we don't believe they're connected. In others, 2 weeks later, they're like, we're exploring the possibility. And I was like, okay, guys, make up your mind. But I think they don't want to connect two unsolved murders because they don't want other people to become fearful and then that take over. It didn't help. People were still not wanting to go out on their back decks at night, making sure their doors were locked 7 times over. People were nervous in the aftermath of these, especially as it kept going and they were not solved.
And I think keeping them separate helped keep them from the police from having tunnel vision on one thing. Like, let's keep them separate until there is something tangible that links them together. Otherwise, they could be missing an opportunity to look at a certain person for each of them separately.
Because that's something we're going to talk about with 2 other cases that happened in the county. Both of those have since been solved because it was somebody connected to them. So if they connected these 2 cases, then they're not looking at someone who Dolores knew, who had a problem with her, or someone Joan may have known they might have had words with someone. Keeping it separate and keeping the investigation separate was really important. And we got a lot of information about these cases because a cold case team came in Bergen County. These are not the only 2 cold cases they were looking at. But when they have them listed on their website, they're listed together. So every other case is its own entry. These 2, you click one button to get to both of them. So I'm going to say that the cold case team is likely looking at these as together now. They released more information than we had, and primarily in Joan's case. And this is something I'm going to ask you. So they released security footage from near Joan, from like the outside of Joan's neighborhood, from the night of the murder. They did not release this for 11 years. What do you guys think about that?
This is one of those things that I struggle with law enforcement, because you try to trust them that they know what they're doing, that they, in their experience and their training, that yes, they have to keep things close to themselves to verify that information when it comes down to actually charging someone with these crimes. But at the same time, when you have surveillance footage, a still from that footage, you don't have to give all of the information out, but give a little bit. The public can help. I also think that times were different, even from 2010 to now, of law enforcement being willing to share information. They realize that the majority of the population wants to help. So yes, people are going to start looking at those photos, going to start thinking, hey, I do know a guy that's that taller. Ooh, I do know a girl that has a purse like that. People are thinking more in an advocacy mind space of how can I help, as opposed to we have to keep all of this information because we don't want the other jurisdictions to have it, or we don't want the public to have it because that's the only information that's going to get a conviction. We're not in that type of world anymore. So I can see where then they might have been a little more closed-lipped about it, and now they're willing to release some things a little bit more. But something as easy as surveillance footage, just a still photo, you don't have to give any additional information. A still photo could have done a lot then.
And you can easily say, this could be a witness. This person was in the area. You don't have to say they were a suspect. But 11 years is a very long time. That person probably looks completely different now. I think if they put it out within even just a couple of months, it could have made a big difference in this case.
I also can't remember anything for a day, let alone 11 years. So I'm not going to remember that someone was in the neighborhood walking through 11 years later.
One of the things with this footage is when someone is walking, so it always goes back to the Missy Beavers case and the person with the weird gait. The way someone walks can matter. And so I just don't know why they held it back for as long as they did. I think it was the right decision to eventually release it. I think it would have been the right decision years ago to also release it. I'm going to link the Bergen County video to it's on their YouTube page. There's a whole little video on the cases, and they show the video footage there. So I'll link that in the show notes and on my website for anyone who's listening, because again, this is audio, as you know, so we can't really show it. But the thing is, there are two videos. And the first one was at approximately 10 p.m. And you see a man who, he looks to me to be wearing shorts, like basketball shorts, and a light colored t-shirt. It looks white, but again, this is a grainy nighttime video, so it could just be a light color. He's walking from a bench on Teaneck Road near Route 4, and he's carrying, they describe it as a satchel-style backpack. I don't think I saw that much detail. But the man then took a left onto Minnell Place, and Joan lived on the corner of Alpine and Minnell. And so he's walking in the direction of Joan's residence shortly before 911 is called. The second video comes from shortly before midnight, so like an hour and 50 minutes later. So again, this is after 911 has been called. And he is leaving the area. It's the same person wearing the same thing, and he's leaving from the direction of Joan's house. And at this point, he is not strolling. Like he strolls in the first video. In this one, he is walking quickly. He looks like he has a cell phone to his ear. He's holding something to his ear. We have to assume it's a cell phone. He passes the bench. He even passes a fire truck that was responding to the scene as he's making his way out of the area. So this man is seen going towards her house near the time of the murder, leaving quickly shortly after. Now, he could be in the area doing a drug buy, and then all of a sudden sirens come and he books it out of there. Like, you know, he could have been there for other reasons, but it would be nice to know that. He may have seen something. He may know something, or he may be the suspect. The video is the quality you expect from a camera. It looks like it's almost up on a building and he's on the sidewalk. So there's a distance between him and the video. it's higher than him, and it's nighttime. So it's got all the great quality you would expect. So they don't give any details, like they're not saying race or ethnicity in their reports, and then also approximate age hasn't been released. They have released his shoe size, though. Maybe not the man in the photo, but the man in Joan's house. To me, it looks like they've released the photo of this footprint that was left at her house. And to me, it's in a sink, right?
It is in the kitchen sink.
That's like a drain, right? In the middle. They have a ruler over it, but it looks like a drain and a metal sink. And there's a footprint in the sink. And that also gives me the idea that he broke in, maybe climbed in a window and stepped on the sink on his way in.
My thought was yes, or if this is someone, if you go with the theory that Dolores or Joan knew who was there or had opened the front door, he exited, or they, because we don't know, man or woman, they exited through a window. And perhaps that was a countermeasure, again, covering up further evidence of maybe we don't even know how long they were in the house. So did he lock the door? Did this take an extended period of time, which is absolutely heartbreaking to think about, which it had to take some time because 55 stab wounds on Dolores and multiple on Joan. That's very difficult. We're not going to get into the details of that, but they exited or stood in the sink somehow, right? And the only thought is that there has to be a window over the sink, like you said, for them to leave. Because, well, it's hard to tell from this photo, to be honest, which way is the shoe print facing. I'm looking at it as like I'm looking down in a sink. So the shoe print is pointed towards the faucet along the back of the sink, which I would assume would be on a wall.
Yeah, the picture doesn't show us where the faucet is, but you have to assume that's the way you would take a picture of a sink. And so it does look like the person standing there may be climbing out. Or I think another possibility is if there's a window there, someone is standing there and throwing things they stole out the window. That's another possibility. Maybe they had someone else with them and that person's handing them things and they're throwing it out the window as they're getting away. We don't know. They did release a picture of the shoe print, which I don't know what it's supposed to tell us. I mean, I don't know if anyone recognizes those ridges. I'm sure they ran it through. There's actually a database of this. It's come up in another case of mine. I'm sure they ran it through the database of shoe patterns. But they say it's approximately a size 9 or 10 men's shoe, or at least that's the men's shoe size. And then based on the footage in the camera, the person who was walking away from the scene, all they've said is they can tell that he's under 160 pounds. But like with the angle of the camera and everything, they can't tell height or anything like that.
So, and this might be just a little outlandish. There's a guy on TikTok that can tell someone's height based on its surrounding factors, which I think is an extraordinary skill.
A lot of math.
Yeah, where he measures the refrigerator behind them, the door frame, whatever, comes up with like shin lengths. It's amazing and way beyond Whitney's scope of math. I wonder if there's something that some way to figure that out from here, because I'm assuming they know where this camera footage was taken from. Based on this footage on the ground, there is a square, whether that is a drainage grate, whether it's a new piece of concrete or something on the road. There's a clear, definitive space, so you should be able to measure said distance where we could get a little bit more information about this person.
In the full video where it's panned out a little bit more, there are other things. There are cars, there's a bench. I think maybe if they took this to someone, they could get more information on him. But I think they're just not quite ready to even start going down that path. If they're really hoping someone just recognizes him or recognizes his walk. In the full video, you can see how he walks. And I mean, it's not terribly unique, but I recognize my husband's walk. If he's coming out of a store and I look in the rearview mirror, I know it's him, even if I don't see his face, because I can recognize how he's walking. And so someone who knows him might recognize his walk. So these are the unsolved cases. And, I covered the Rob Cantor case, which is how I came across these. And he was killed March 6th, but the 911 call came in just after midnight on March 7th. He also lived in Teaneck, New Jersey. And so Joan lived in Teaneck and she was murdered and her house was set on fire in August. And then in March of the next year, we have another person who lived alone who was murdered. The person set the house on fire. And it's like, what in the world are the odds, right? But when you look at the cases more, there's really not a lot of similarities. Rob was, I think, like 15 years younger than Joan. He was also a marathon runner. He wasn't exactly a vulnerable person living in their home. He was shot once in the head, and then the fire was set. He was not stabbed and he was not beaten. And they had a solid suspect from day one. He was in a relationship with a woman whose soon-to-be ex-husband wasn't happy about it. And that same day that Rob was killed, he had met one of their children for the first time. And it was shortly after the guy had been served with divorce papers, so they think it was he just flipped out. He was tried. His name's Tony Tung. He was tried and convicted. He appealed successfully, and then he was tried and convicted again, which is pretty much the same thing that happened in the next case, which you covered, not Rob Cantor's case, but you covered the other case, which is the case of Barbara Vanieri. So do you want to tell me about that case?
Yes. So just like the two unsolved cases, Barbara was an elderly woman, 70 years old. She lived alone. Her husband had died a few years prior to this event. And this was September 14th of 2012. Around noon, neighbors heard a smoke alarm going off. And so they were jumped on it and very quickly called a 911 to report this fire. This happened way quicker, I believe, than the other two cases. Authorities were able to get there quickly. She was found nude, though, and she did have burns all over her body from the fire. The accelerant was applied directly to her body, which I don't believe we know that in the other two cases, if that had happened to them or if the accelerant was just around the house. This one, like you said, is a solved case as well. It ended up being the son of her boss was convicted. There was an appeal process, and it ended up being retried, and he was convicted again. So very crazy case. He needed to borrow money or something like that. I can't remember all the details in that one, but I knew it was all about he needed money to pay off a loan or something of that sort.
And if I remember correctly, Barbara was a well-known real estate agent in the community. She was a little bit more wealthy, or maybe not wealthy, but well off. And perhaps that's why he approached her. I know that she fought like heck to fight off this murder. And the reason that he was caught, I guess you could say, or the reason that he was charged is that his DNA was found under her fingernails.
So this case was solved because they got there before the fire destroyed the body, therefore destroying DNA. And so there was evidence at the scene. And I thought it was, as we're talking about patterns and coincidences in trial, I thought it was interesting that in Rob Cantor's case and in Barbara's case, the suspect was someone they knew. They had a trial. They got convicted. They had a successful appeal, which barely ever happened. And here we've got two of them. And then within the last year, they've both been retried and both found guilty again. It just reminds us that coincidences in cases do happen even when they're not related. So when we're looking at Dolores and Joan's cases, we have to look at the similarities and the differences to see if this is really more than just a coincidence. It really could be a coincidence. It could actually even be someone did this to Dolores, so whoever did it to Joan copycatted it on purpose. That's always a possibility. So when we're looking at, okay, the differences and the similarities, another thing that investigators like to look at are what they call the standout features. Lots of people are bludgeoned to death. Lots of people are stabbed, and fire is a common way to cover up a crime. Those similarities are not unique. So what is unique about these cases? They're elderly women living alone who don't seem to have any other enemies. Are those really standouts? The only thing I found in looking at it is I Google mapped both of their houses, and they both lived on corners. Research has shown, because apparently they poll burglars, I guess, I don't know. Research has apparently shown that burglars prefer corner houses because they're more accessible and they have fewer neighbors.
I also feel that there's multiple escape routes because on a corner, you've got likely at least 2 different roads to go down, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. There's multiple ways to get away.
So I think, the corner house thing, if we're talking about a robber, and this was a robbery gone wrong, but I still have a hard time seeing it that way because they were both beaten and stabbed. So even if Joan wasn't stabbed, they haven't released how many times they believe she was stabbed. Her body was in much worse condition. They had to use dental records. So it's possible they just don't know how many times she was stabbed because they can't tell. But beating and stabbing, that's a lot more than a robber trying to just subdue them and get stuff and get out. But I mean, who's targeting two older ladies who didn't know each other, who didn't have overlapping friends or groups as far as anyone can tell? I mean, I looked. It's not like Dolores attended the Quaker church as well. Like, I can't find any connection there. She left her house to like walk to the store, and that's about it. She wasn't at, county political events. So I don't really know what their connection is. But I do think that it shows with these 4 cases, the 2 that got solved were killed by someone they knew. And it's so much easier to solve a case when you're looking for someone the victim knew.
It really is. I like to think of it as if you trust everyone you know, then most likely you're not going to become a victim. So in our line of work, it can become very daunting and very scary, anxiety-ridden, because all we're doing is learning about murder after murder. But I'm like, most of the time it's someone the people knew. And so I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse, but it's a thing.
It makes me question all of my friends.
Yes.
And we are going to be able to question all of our friends in person in a couple weeks because we're going to be at the True Crime Podcast Festival. I cannot wait.
The programming this year, there's so many panels. I feel really bad that I may not be at our table much because I'm going to be in the panels, which I'm so glad there's guaranteed like gallery hours this year so that we will get to have those interactions. But I'm excited to listen to several people speak this year.
And then next year you'll be running a conference. How's that going? How's Advocacy Con coming?
I'm super excited. We've got some really great people coming, and I hope that this is everything we want it to be. We have big hopes and dreams for this conference of what it can do and how it can help. And I'm just excited to see it all kind of come to fruition.
I'm excited for you. Unfortunately, I will not be there for the first year because, I mean, our school hadn't released their spring break calendar yet, or their calendar for the next school year. So I was like, yep, I'll be there. And then they released the spring break calendar. Who put spring break at the end of March?
Apparently Kansas City, Missouri.
I'm still trying to work it to where I fly in for a day, for part of it, but it depends on those airline flights and the cost. I'm hoping to like show up, even if it's just for a few hours, because I am so proud of what you're doing and how the 3 of you have come together to make this happen in a big way for your first year. You thought big and you planned as though this was going to be a success, and it's already big, and it's not even till March of next year.
Well, thank you. It means the world to have your support. Eric and Melissa and I talk about this all the time, how weird it is, regardless of what you believe, whether it's kismet, the universe, good juju, manifestation, whatever. But that True Crime Podcast Festival in Kansas City changed all of our lives in some big, crazy way.
Amazing having your life changed in downtown Kansas City. I'm happy for it. It brought you into my lives, and so that's great. And now we hang out and go do fun stuff and go to conferences together. But before we wrap up, I just want to remind my listeners that you guys are Navigating Advocacy. You're available, I'm assuming, on every podcast platform. And you guys do YouTube?
Listen. we made a goal at the beginning of Whitney made a goal at the beginning of this year to make YouTube a priority. And the first 6-7 episodes, I did really, really good at it. And then something happened and I've fallen off the bandwagon a little bit on that. But my goal that week before True Crime Podcast Festival, while I'm at Colorado, I'm going to sit on the balcony with my coffee, stare at the mountains, and get caught up.
I mean, there are worse places to have to work from, so it's pretty amazing.
It's very true.
Thank you to Navigating Advocacy for joining me this week. If you know anything about the murders of Dolores Alliotts and Joan Davis, you can call the Bergen County Prosecutor at 201-646-2300, or you can leave a tip at a link that is in the show notes. Also in the show notes is a link to my website, which will have more information on the person of interest seen near Joan's house. And while you're at it, check out Advocacy Con, which is a groundbreaking conference designed to bring together experts, nonprofit organizations, families of the missing and murdered, and of course, individuals like yourself who are passionate about advocating for justice. It is in March of 2025 and will feature guests such as Beth Holloway, the Gabby Petito Foundation, Julie Murray, and Sarah Turney. All this information with everything else is, as you know, in the show notes.